Hi, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us for this Learning and Growing 2021 presentation, 10 Tips to Provide Effective Feedback to Student Writers. My name is Daisy Buckhouse, and I am a member of the Training and Support team here at Hawks Learning. So our presenters today are Professor Sudeepa Gulati and Dr. Meena Singhal from Long Beach City College. We will have a live Q&A session after the presentation, so please enter any questions into the Q&A as we go. So now I will hand it over to our professors for our presentation today.
Thank you, Daisy, for that introduction. I'm Meena Singhal, and I would like to welcome all of you to today's session. So just to give you a little bit of background, we have decided to really focus on the issue of writer feedback. If we could bring up the screen so I could see the PowerPoint. Wonderful. Thank you. So our topic today is 10 tips to provide effective feedback to student writers. And just to give you a little bit of context, I will be talking about the nuts and bolts of feedback, and my colleague and co-presenter, Sudeepa Gulati, will be looking at this topic more from the emotional and affective aspects as related to feedback. I think one of the reasons we wanted to do a deeper dive into this issue is because both of us have been teaching composition for quite a while. While I have taught K to 12, quite a bit of my teaching experience has also been in the community college setting. And certainly those of us who teach writing know what a daunting task the grading of papers can be. It's not an unusual scenario to be presented with 50, 60, or 100 papers over a weekend. And that task itself can be very overwhelming. And I think, sometimes we get so focused in on communicating quickly just to get through that massive stack a little faster, which is certainly understandable on many levels. But I think even the two of us, as we were having this discussion, realized that, sometimes we need to take a step back and really think about the amount of thought that we are putting into our feedback, and more specifically, how our students might perceive that. Before we move on, I would also say that one of the considerations here is, we have to think about our diverse classrooms these days. And while many of us are teaching in environments where our learners are predominantly first language speakers, English language speakers, or native speakers, we're also dealing with classrooms where we have students of different language backgrounds, what we call our L2 learners, or perhaps our English as a second language or English as an additional language learners. I would say that whether we're talking about L1, first language learners, or second language learners, there are certainly similarities between both groups. Certainly both groups will employ a recursive process when it comes to writing, involving their planning, their drafting, their writing, and their revising when working on papers. And both groups will obviously benefit from the personalized instruction that builds on their existing literacy, cultural, and intellectual backgrounds. Having said that, it's important to recognize the variances that we have in class in terms of our learners, not only in terms of proficiency level of our first language learners and what they come into the classroom with, but also our second language learners. We characterize them as sometimes resident ESL learners in the K to 12 setting, international learners in the higher education setting, ESL learners, generation 1.5 learners if they have come here at an earlier age and gone through the school system, English as a foreign language if they've learned English in their home country. So I think it is important to recognize that simply the discrepancy of these terms suggests how complex and multifaceted this group is. So as we progress through this presentation, I would encourage you to think about these learners sort of being along a continuum as opposed to two very separate, distinct groups. That gap is becoming smaller and smaller, as we know, given the internet, given media, given global migration, social media, and so forth. So just something to keep in mind as we move along in this presentation. Next slide. So in terms of writer feedback, a few things I do want to mention before I look at some of these more closely in some follow-up slides. It is important when we are giving feedback to really focus on fewer comments that are meaningful to our students. I think it's often very easy to be overwhelmed with the feedback that we are giving, and sometimes students don't know what to do with all of that. Try to address the errors that are repeated. For example, I had a Khmer speaking student who would consistently make errors in subject-verb agreement. So besides other errors, it was important for me to point out specifically that error, and we could address that with additional work on subject-verb agreement, but it also allowed him to correct it for that paper and any future drafts. So really focusing on repeated errors that come up can really go a long way in terms of addressing student issues and papers. Also start with your bigger concerns. For example, we spend a lot of time on argument papers. So what I try to do is to really look at the argument, how well has it been presented, really focusing on the content. Is the thesis clear? Does the body of the essay support the thesis? Are the supporting points valid? So really focusing on big picture and then working your way down to some of the smaller issues like the grammar and the mechanics. Respond to all learners and second language learners using a variety of strategies that combine higher order and lower order concerns. So I've spoken to this in my previous bullet, but also there are ways to really hone in on what students are doing in their papers. As I said, be selective in your feedback. You can't address every single thing. One of the things that does work well are error codes. So for example, in my courses, I use a chart of error codes. It could be symbols, it could be numbers, and each of those symbols or numbers represents a particular kind of error. This can be presented to the student at the beginning of the term. Students do get used to something like this, and before you know it, it's automated. They know exactly what those symbols mean. It's important to run through that with the class, but also give your students semantic or syntactic models so that they understand this is the mistake and this is how I correct it. So those models become really important. Give students a chance to actually correct them themselves. So in this way, an error code chart can be extremely useful. And then verbal feedback can be extremely useful as well through individual conferencing, which I'll discuss in another slide. Just another area to draw your attention to is to remember that writing is a very vulnerable act, and our feedback directly impacts our students' internal dialogue and self-perceptions and self-confidence as writers. So definitely something to keep in mind as we are giving our students feedback. And then finally, to consider the amount of correction that is necessary to foster incremental improvement. And on that note, let's move to the next slide. So this was something I came across as I was doing some reading. And the question really is, how much is too much? So let me read this to you. And I think this analogy is a good one. Think of a child learning to play the saxophone. The child has practiced and plays the rehearsed piece for her weekly lesson. Imagine a music teacher responding like this. I heard two squeaks, one wrong note, an underplayed dynamic at letter C, a missed quarter rest on the fourth measure, and you completely ignored the dynamics. Watch your fingering, your breathing, and your posture. Pay attention to the time signature. While you're at it, give it some feeling. It's supposed to sound like music, not noise. So I think that in very well expresses sometimes what we get caught up in as instructors or as teachers of writing. We have got to keep the feedback really selective, and understand that writing, just like any other skill or the honing of any other skill, is a process. The improvement of skills is something that will take time. It's not something that happens overnight. Next slide. So asking questions instead of making statements when giving feedback is an excellent way to encourage students to figure out answers on their own. One of the things that I like to do is really ask these questions in the margin comments of their paper, and really to get them thinking. You can't always be telling them what to do, but you need to be able to stimulate that thinking. Your marginal comments can differ. Sometimes it is focusing on those lower level concerns, but an error code chart might help with that. And sometimes it's really focusing on the big picture, but it's really a way to direct your learners to make changes, but also to develop and encourage learning, probe thinking, and also enhance those critical thinking skills. So questions should really be helping your students expand on their potential as writers. Next slide. I also like to spend a great deal of time conferring with students, and I think setting up individual conferences can be immensely helpful to our students. It is an opportunity to really get to know them better as writers and as people. It's important to point out that they get to know themselves better as well as writers. It's an opportunity to foster relationships, and it makes it easier for them to accept suggestions for improvement. Um, I try to set up individual conferences. They've got 3 major papers in the particular class that I am teaching, and I do try to set up conferences for these students. Oftentimes, as I'm reading a paper, it is, as I said, it's very easy to sort of get caught up, especially with inexperienced writers or second language writers, in the numerous language use errors. And sometimes we have to dig a lot deeper to really find and comprehend some of their interesting ideas that are deeply buried within those errors. So allowing time to have a discussion, to question them, to probe their thinking, to ask, what exactly did you mean here? How does that tie into what you're saying next? Can you explain this to me? Sometimes through the process of rephrasing and dialoguing, students are also learning how to improve their own writing. It's also a way to create a comfortable conversation with your learners, and to clarify any sort of misinterpretation before those first drafts are turned into you. And of course, this can be done face-to-face. Many of us are teaching online now. And I do like to set up sessions over Zoom to work with them one-on-one to review papers in this way. Next. And then finally, I would say use a 1-to-1 ratio when you are providing feedback. You don't want to correct every single errors. Focus on the errors that do interfere substantially with meaning, or that the student is unable to correct without assistance. Sometimes you will need to provide that contextualized explanation of why a particular format or tense needs to be used. If you think about English, we know that there are aspects of any language that are not solely rule-based, but there are certainly variations. So it's hard to explain why an experienced writer's mixed use of tense could make sense, but a second language student's mixed use of tense is confusing. So actually providing a more contextualized explanation as to why a particular tense might be more effective or preferred in that instance of their paper will actually go a long way. Knowing what is being done well is just as important as knowing what needs improvement. Give students a chance to correct their own errors, and avoid the impulse to take over their work. This is their work after all. And this is where feedback, dialoguing, and conferencing can be very, very helpful. And if we're constantly giving the prescribed feedback, it doesn't encourage critical thinking or creativity. And really stay within that zone of proximal development. Sometimes things can be so complex that they're not able to move to the next level. Focus on what they are able to understand, that whole notion of comprehensible input, and making sure that that threshold is not so high that they can't actually make changes and move to the next step of writing improvement. The point is to not go from point A to point Z, but to go from point A to point B, and to see growth as they progress and improve their writing. Next slide. And then finally, I would say keep feedback timely. Timely feedback builds trust. Make sure that you're suggesting immediate next steps. With reference to success criteria, you might be providing a rubric, certainly at the beginning, so students know what to expect in terms of the writing assignment, but also as you're giving feedback, and to highlight those areas in a draft and in the rubric that they still need to work on. And to finally remember that the goal is to really take the students' work to the next level, not to fix everything. I will now pass it on to my co-presenter, Sudeepa, who will look at the more affective and emotional aspects of writing feedback.
Thank you, Meena. Good morning, everyone. One of the things I want to talk about also with students and their writing is reflection and how important it is. If we allow students to find their own mistakes, and they may not find everything, and we know that, but at least they're able to reflect on what they've done wrong, what they feel they can improve on. And this is really a critical step in their understanding of how they can fix their errors. And we also want to allow them to find their own mistakes, to make their own corrections, and it makes them more responsible for their work. If they're provided with rubrics and explanations in advance, so they know what to expect, that will help them identify areas where they can grow and improve. And their perceptions of their strengths and weaknesses, if we can dialogue with them about their improvements, instead of just giving them unsatisfactory or telling them what they did wrong, like that music teacher. Instead of telling them what they did wrong, we can help them be more prepared to accept help, and they won't negatively internalize suggestions that we make for them, because sometimes that can be really disheartening and they can feel really discouraged if we give them a lot of negative feedback. Another thing that I know my colleague and I like to do is to encourage students to write reflective letters, because this really helps them focus on how they feel as writers. So questions like, what did you do well? What could be better? What areas were difficult for you? And then my favorite one is to give yourself a grade and justify it. And not everyone will necessarily, sometimes they will give themselves an A, but if they're brutally honest with themselves about how they feel about their writing, they may not. And they know how much effort they've put into their papers. So sometimes they will be honest and not necessarily give themselves an A, which means they know they have to work harder. So self-reflection definitely builds metacognitive awareness. And metacognition is the awareness of our own thinking and the strategies that we are using. It enables students to be more mindful of what they're doing and how the skills they learn might be used in different situations. So if they're able to mentally process what they are doing and to think outside of their writing, think outside of what they're doing, that can improve their ability to learn. Another thing we don't want to do is we don't want to underscore what our student writers did wrong. Rather, we want them to see what is confusing to the reader. So it kind of takes the burden off of them and makes them look at what the audience or the reader might interpret. So questions like this: will the audience be confused about how the hook relates to the thesis? Or what is your connection between the hook and the thesis? If we ask them that, it takes them outside of their own thinking and writing and puts it on the reader. What might the reader interpret this as? And we also want them to paraphrasing so that if they're able to paraphrase, we know they've understood, especially if it's a research paper. Paraphrasing research means that they're using their own voice and they've actually understood the research that they're referring to. Another thing that we are concerned about is to help students understand themselves. So we want their feedback to make them see their own strengths and weaknesses. If we point out patterns, and I know my colleague talked about using error codes, another helpful tool is to use error logs. And I've used error logs many times with my students. And if you do them on Excel, that you can actually color code them. And that's how they can develop the ability to see patterns in their writing, see where they're making mistakes, even from the lower order level, the grammar, the syntax, the mechanics, and moving into more of the structure. So by putting these errors that they're making, repeated errors that they're making into a log, it can help them see patterns and help them identify where they need to improve. Sometimes students tend to be a little verbose, and another way to maybe encourage them is to acknowledge that they take time to find meaningful, precise words, but sometimes that may be more difficult for the reader to understand, and it's helpful if they're more precise and concise. Another thing we want to do is to try to avoid attaching a grade to feedback. And of course, all the students are usually targeting that A, but sometimes they need to really focus on how we can improve, they can improve as writers, how we can help them improve as writers. And using rubrics can help, rubrics, explanations, positive along with constructive feedback. We also have to be aware of how ready they are to receive feedback. If it's a beginning writer or maybe a second language learner, sometimes they may not receive the feedback in the same way as somebody who's a more experienced writer. And if we try to think of how we would want to receive feedback, what would we want or not want a teacher to tell us? What would help us grow and what might be more damaging maybe and not foster growth? And I think, Meena, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that we have covered everything, but as we leave this presentation, I just think it's important to emphasize, we are very busy professionals, all of us are, but to really step into our students' shoes and understand what the act of writing means to them, how close they can get to their work, how we can help them take ownership of their work, and really work alongside with them to really make them much more confident as students, as student writers, eventually getting to the point where, they're much more comfortable, just even and reliable on themselves in terms of being able to make writing improvements.
There are a couple questions in the chat.
Yep, I was about to say we do have a few questions. If you guys can see them, you're more than welcome to answer them live right now.
There is a question about whether this will be recorded, and I know Daisy did say that this session would be recorded. Thank you, Sudeepa, for typing an answer to that question.
Oh, I didn't quite finish the answer, but yeah, I'll finish typing that one.
And then I do see, are you discussing freshman level writing or that of an advanced course in grammar and composition? We were actually addressing both. So yes, advanced writing as well as freshman level writing. What about advising second language writers who are in graduate courses other than English? I would say much of what we talked about would essentially be the same. I think though what we have to consider is, what is the purpose of the writing? Is the piece eventually going to be published? Are we talking about a thesis or a dissertation? So the end goal obviously would be different. It has to be an error-free document. But I think as students are learning, they're working, they're improving the English, much of what we address today would be the same. I would also say that, at the graduate level, one of the things that students are lacking is really models, understanding things like what is a literature review? What does that entail? How do I actually write one? What kind of language is used? If we're thinking about, so there's particular academic language, I would say, that also needs to be taught, and the skills associated with using that language depending on the genre, the paper, the thesis, a research paper, etc. Sudeepa, feel free to jump in anytime. I see a question about how do you manage to find time to do this. I think both of us do use the error codes. Individual conferencing can go a long way. I mean, it can take 30 minutes to get through a paper, even longer if you're writing comments, but sometimes individual conferencing, even 15 minutes with a student can make the process go a lot faster. And I think there's just a greater depth of understanding about what a student needs to do given that feedback, just because of the nature of the dialogue and the way in which something is presented. Sudeepa, I'll let you jump in.
Right. I've noticed with the online teaching, especially, it's so much easier to conference with the students when they share the screen, they share their paper, you can mark it up, you can tell them to read things out loud. It goes a lot faster, and they can see it, and you can annotate right on the paper. And it's just a really effective way to help them see what they need to fix. How do you let beginning writers know they have not met the standards of the course? That's a tricky one, because sometimes they just haven't had the experience. We have the opportunity to send our students to the writing center sometimes, or to get tutors from the learning center. So if there are patterns, you can actually recommend that they work on these particular areas. And we also send them a lot of links sometimes to, if it's like a grammar point they're working on, or if it's thesis statements that they're struggling with. Sometimes we can just send them external links of activities that they can work on, activities they can practice with to help them improve.
So I see a question here. Do you have a visual sample? We do have a sample. Our email addresses are on the last slide. Feel free to send us an email, and we would be happy to send this to you. I also see a question here on, sometimes second language writers don't paraphrase well, and they end up plagiarizing. I think this is an area that requires deliberate practice. We spend a lot of time in class working on paraphrasing, summarizing, because of course then those skills show up when they are working on research papers. One of the things I always try to encourage them to do is to read a text and then put it away, and without looking at it, to really write from memory. The likelihood is that you probably are only remembering the main ideas. And it's really just forcing you to then use your own words. And once that is done, to go back and look at it. We will also practice this in group format, paraphrasing and dividing students into groups, having them paraphrase a paragraph, each group responsible for something else, and then ending up writing a group summary on the board. So there are multiple ways of approaching this, and it's a valid question. It's not an easy area to address, but again, it's encouraging them to trust themselves as writers, and to really use their own voice.
There's a really good question about students getting frustrated if they don't see a grade. That's a very valid question, and it's very true that they're so focused on the grade for their GPA or whatever it is. But I always did, and I still do, 2 drafts. So the first draft I give, and yes, it's time consuming. It depends how many students you have, how long the papers are. But I always did second drafts. So the first draft would be sort of just an overview, a preliminary, idea of where they're at. And then I would give them some kind of feedback that they could improve for the next paper. So the second paper was always graded, or I would grade the first draft and say, if you make these improvements or if you follow these suggestions, I can improve your grade. I can bump up your grade. So that seemed to work for most students. So giving them sort of a second opportunity. And some people didn't want to rewrite. If they were happy with the first grade, even if it was, 75%, that was fine. But the ones who really do want to improve and sincerely want to improve, they will make the effort to do a second draft. So I guess there's a couple ways you could go about it.
There is a question here on how do you comment on developmental student sentence that is illogical and has scrambled syntax? I can speak to it from the advanced classes, and then Sudeepa might want to jump in, but sometimes it's a matter of, it depends on the nature of the error. It may be revisiting a particular grammar point to address that kind of syntactic error. Sometimes it's sitting down with the student and really asking them, what exactly did you mean here? Can you walk me through your paper? And going through it that way. And it's actually quite surprising. Oftentimes when students are describing this to you verbally, oftentimes that makes more sense than what they've actually put down on paper. So sometimes having them actually record and then listening to that recording can help. Sometimes having them read their paper out loud, oftentimes they are able to identify themselves that you're right, this doesn't make sense.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and then sometimes it requires explicit practice with the structure to actually remedy that. Go ahead, Sudeepa.
Just when they're reading out loud, they're actually activating 3 senses: their sight, their sound, and their speaking. So it actually makes them more aware of what they're writing. When they read it to themselves, they actually hear it. I read it out loud. They actually hear it, and they can usually hear, if their language skills are developed enough, they can usually hear if something doesn't make sense. And that's another way to approach it. Just have them, and I've also tried having them read it from bottom to top. Does each sentence connect, even with those transition words? Does it make sense? If it's scrambled, sometimes that will also reveal itself if they read it instead of top to bottom, bottom to top.
So I think we have addressed all the questions that came our way, Daisy.
Yes, looks like
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much for presenting today. It was a very, very engaging, lots of engaging content. So thank you both to Professor Sudeepa Gulati and Dr. Meena Singhal, and thank you all for attending today. If any of you are interested in demo access to any of our products, please click on the link that I'm about to send in the chat now. And please let me know if there's anything else that we can help you with. If you have any of those questions, please direct them to us at marketing@hawkslearning.com. And do know that we will be emailing all of you a link to the recorded video here today. So do be on the lookout for that for once that is ready to go. I'm trying to paste this into the chat for you guys. And after that, you guys are all good to go. Thank you again so much for joining us today, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Daisy. Thank you.